afternoon, everyone. First, can you all hear me? Can you? I have two very bad habits, those of you who have taken trial advocacy will quickly learn that the first thing you do when you have a real problem is you disclose it and draw the sting. So I'm going to disclose my two bad habits. You've probably gleaned one of them already. I talk very fast. And the second is sometimes I let my voice drop. So if at any point you don't catch what I said or you can't hear me, just let me know. Don't worry about interrupting me or anything like that. I'm used to it. It's happened many times. It's a real honor to be here. As much as Tom talked about how early it was to get up, it was about 4:30 in the morning when I had to get up and come out here yesterday. It actually is an honor and a privilege to be here. And I was thrilled when Tom called me, not only to reconnect and see how he's doing, but also the opportunity to come out to Oregon and talk to you. I really appreciate the privilege to do that. As Tom told you a little bit about our history together, we did deliver pizzas. Tom had really, with a bit of brilliance, I think, had orchestrated it so that he answered the phone, and I went out and delivered the pizzas. And I got to tell you, February in New Haven, not a lot of fun. But I was not, again, I have to disclose, I was not a very good pizza deliverer. I had two major problems. One, it was a little slow, so the pizzas would often be cold. And two, the bikes that we had to use were not particularly good. And in fact, I just disclosed this to Tom the other day. One of my vivid memories of this is riding my bike, the bike that gave us across the quad at like about midnight. We shut down at midnight, it's just the last run of the night. And the pizza boxes were on these sort of platforms on the back of the bike. And about halfway across the campus, I had this thud, and the bike slows down a lot, but I don't really, so I just pedal harder. I turned around when I get to park my bike, and I've been dragging the pizza for about a quarter mile. But I just went ahead and delivered it anyway. And as a result, I didn't get very many tips. I don't even think I got $1. No, I was there. Hopefully I've made a better lawyer than a pizza deliverer. But history will be the judge. But I'll keep you aside. It's really an honor to be here to talk about public service and public interest. This is a particularly poignant moment for me to think about that, and because I'm feeling a little nostalgic. I'm in the process of moving on from the Department of Justice after being there for about 16 years. And I have to tell you, and the theme of my talk will be, a career in public service is the most rewarding thing you can do. I often say it's the second best decision I ever made. The first best, of course, was getting married. But it was really a tremendous decision. And I wanted to do it from my earliest days in college. And you may be asking yourself, Tom gave you a little sense of where I came from. I grew up in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Tom may have told you, and those of you who know him will know that he was an assistant U.S. attorney in my hometown. That's how I actually reconnected. Tom keeps popping up at all these odd junctures in my life. And I think it's been reciprocated. And he worked with my brother-in-law, who was an AUSA out there. And you may be wondering, how does a skinny, fast-talking nerd from Iowa, and I am a nerd, no question about it, who still maintains, who's a passionate follower of the Iowa Hawkeyes, even though I didn't go to school, and who maintains that real pizza is Chicago-style pizza, which, if you say that in New York, you'll shoot in a fist fight. How did I end up in Brooklyn, of all places? I'll give you a little bit, I'll try and encapsulate this story so you're not incredibly bored. But it basically goes back to college. First off, I took a course in college on criminal justice. And Tom and I were just talking about that the other day. He said, well, I really wish I would have taken that course. I said, well, the professor wasn't that great, but it did give me a chance to learn a little bit about the criminal justice system. And I sort of knew going into college I wanted to be a lawyer, but I didn't know what kind of lawyer. And so this class, I had to go around and watch trial proceedings in various courts in New Haven. And I went to family court, and I went to misdemeanor court, which was interesting because you learn a lot about what happened the night before on screen, and there's some things that happened that weren't that great. I never told my parents some of the things I learned, and probably a good thing. And then I go to talk to my professor, and she said, well, you know what, there's a very large federal case that's being tried on a change of venue in the courthouse in New Haven. You should go watch that, because my job is to write a comparative paper. And so I go in and I sit down in the back of this courtroom, and it's what you would expect. You walk into the federal courthouse, it's a turn-of-the-century federal courthouse. You know, it looks like what you would expect. Think something out of a movie. I sit down in the back, and the trial is a huge, complicated public corruption case that involved looting the money out of the Queens Parking Violations Bureau, which you can expect. Parking meters and parking violations, parking tickets in New York is like a license to print money. It generates a ton of income for the city. And these guys were dipping into it. The case had such notoriety because one of the main targets of the investigation had shot himself in his car on an expressway right outside where the Mets played baseball. And this had got a lot of attention. And they felt that there was no way that they could get a jury in New York who did not know something about the case. So they tried to change venue in New Haven. So I sit down in the back of the courtroom, and I don't really know much about what's going on. And the case is being tried by Rudy Giuliani himself for the government, and Gerald Lefcourt, who's a fantastic defense lawyer for the defendant. And so the first thing that happens is the judge comes out and says, well, the parties introduce themselves, and Rudy Giuliani stands up and says, I'm Rudy Giuliani, and I represent the United States of America. And right then, I'm like, you can represent the United States of America and prosecute bad guys? That, sign me up. How do I do that? So that sort of, for me, was the formative moment when I said, I want to be an assistant U.S. attorney. And when I was in law school, I went to law school in Chicago. I took an internship with the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Northern District of Illinois, and it just confirmed what I thought about wanting to be an AUSA. And I worked for a few years, paid off my debts. As soon as I paid off my debts, I sent out my application to all the offices in the country. At the time, when I sent out my application, the offices were having a hiring freeze. It's not unusual when there's a transition from one administration to another for there to be a hiring freeze. It's basically, when that happens, there's new U.S. attorneys coming in. We're just finishing that off now. So that's the reason why I was kind of original between the last administration and the beginning of this administration. And that, it's not unusual for there to be a hiring freeze. It's also part when everyone's getting their budgets together. And there were only two offices in the country at the time that were hired, the Eastern District of New York and the Southern District of New York. And they sent me an application back and said, are you interested? I have to confess, when I was in college, I went back and forth to get to New Haven through New York. And this was back in the 80s when New York really wasn't at its zenith. It was a little grim. And I really didn't want to work in New York. I told my wife I would go to New York for one job. This, of course, was that job. I go to my first interview in the Eastern District of New York, and I literally had never set foot in Brooklyn before. Never been in Brooklyn. Apparently the cab driver had not been either, because it took a while for us to figure out where the courthouse was. But I was lucky enough to get the job, and I was fortunate enough to have the good sense to say yes. At the time that I got the job, I thought what I would do is work there for 3 years, because we have a 3-year commitment, and then transfer maybe to Chicago or maybe the Midwest. In fact, the sort of epilogue of the story, my first day in the office in Brooklyn, they sent out a mass email saying, if anyone wants to work in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, let us know. And that's, I think, about the same time that Tom joined the office. And then I got a phone call from the hiring person in Chicago saying, are you still interested in the job? And I said, yes, but your timing is a little bad, because now I'm sitting here at my desk in Brooklyn. But it's the best decision I ever made. But it was a total plunge into the unknown. As I said, I'd never been to Brooklyn before, so when I get the job, I'm very happy. I call my parents up, and they live in right on the Iowa-Illinois border, a small town called Galena. And this will reveal another aspect of my character. My sensibilities is basically mired in the late 80s and early 90s. I'll make a couple of references to that, but I'm going to do that right now. How many of you guys have seen The Field of Dreams? Okay, so you know the part when they go to this small town called Chisholm, Minnesota, and Kevin Costner's character goes out for a walk, and he sees The Godfather on the marquee, and checks the date on the license plate. The town they filmed that in is Galena, Illinois. It's a very picturesque town. It's on the Iowa-Illinois border. And so my folks are in this town. I call them up, and I'm like, guess what? I'm going to be an assistant U.S. attorney. I'm very happy. Then my dad, who's a fairly sophisticated guy, says, well, where? And I said, Brooklyn. Long pause. And then my dad, who's also a little bit of a smart guy, says, well, that's where racketeering was invented. And it turns out he's exactly right. It's the best decision I made. But it had some transitions. When I got there, actually, literally, this is like some kind of a movie. We arrive on the day before Thanksgiving, and it's cold and it's snowing, and we take the wrong exit. And we take the wrong exit in Brooklyn, that can be a problem. And so we're driving, down. It's like you just picture what you would think, sort of gritty Brooklyn would look like. Cars up on blocks, guys standing around, trash barrels, with flames coming out of them, garbage everywhere, everything like that. And and that's where we work. And my wife looks at me. We had just got married. Like the first thing we did was buy a car, get married, and move to Brooklyn. And she says, "What have you done?" I said, "Oh, honey, it looks like there's a lot of crime." But it was a great decision. And I'm not an urban guy. We lived right downtown Brooklyn. That was very gritty. That was a little tough for me to get adjusted to, but it has been a great decision. The people of New York are fantastic. The opportunities I've gotten have just been wonderful. As I said, it's the second best thing I did. And you can tell by how that story rolled out what the first best thing I did. Let me talk a little bit about, I want to tell you a little bit about why I think public service is a great career, some of the things about public service that make it really special. And when I'm talking about public service, I'm going to draw on my experiences because, of course, that's all I know, right? And somebody once told me that everyone's the star of their own novel, and believe me, I've got the ego to be the star of my own novel. But when I talk about public service, I'm talking about all aspects of it, not just working as a prosecutor, but working as a defense lawyer, which really is critically important work. Doing pro bono work, which you may do even if you go to the private sector, and I would encourage you to do. You have an opportunity as lawyers, as future lawyers, to be involved in public service, and I cannot encourage you enough to get involved in it. Why? Well, some very practical reasons. First, you get loads of experience. One of the things I knew I wanted to do was try RICO murder trials. That was a dream of mine when I figured out sort of what being an assistant U.S. attorney was all about, and I got the opportunity to do that. It really is. Now, those kinds of cases are tough. They're demanding, they're emotionally demanding, they're professionally demanding. It may not be for everybody, but that's what I wanted to do, and I got the chance to do that. I also got some other opportunities. One of the things that happens in pro bono or in government services, you find yourself in extraordinary situations. So literally, I found myself, Tom was talking about this, taking the first deposition of any witness ever taken in Russia after the wall came down in 1996 for a extortion trial that I did, which was a remarkable experience. Maybe at some point later on, I'll tell you what happened after that when I found myself in a room with a bunch of Russians, a bunch of firearms, a whole lot of vodka, and several people who were drunk out of their minds. So I'll tell you about that some other juncture. Perhaps when I've had hope for you myself. The other thing, though, I found, that's one example, but I found myself in other circumstances, too, some of which were very moving, I'll never forget. One of them was going to a hangar in Galveston, Long Island, where they had reconstructed TWA Flight 800. Those of you who may remember, TWA Flight 800 was a 747 that blew up off the coast of Long Island, killing everybody aboard. And when it happened, nobody really knew exactly why it happened. It took us about 2 or 3 years of investigation to figure that out. And when they do that, they reconstruct the plane. They literally put it back together. And it was a haunting experience to step into a hangar and look at this reconstructed aircraft that literally had 300 people in it. Particularly poignant when you went to a section where they reconstructed the seats in the side of the cabin. It's something that I'll never forget. Similarly, I found myself standing at Ground Zero at the World Trade Center about 3 days after the attack at dawn in the mist and the rain, looking at what was left of the World Trade Center. And that was a very poignant reminder. It's difficult even to contemplate. Everybody who lives in New York, particularly those of us who are in the law enforcement community, lost friends and family that day. I didn't lose any family members, thank God, but I did lose some friends. And it is a poignant reminder that a lot of what we do as prosecutors and as public service is to make sure that something like that never happens again. You also get to work with some of the most interesting and motivated people you'll ever work with. The best lawyers I've ever worked with are my friends and colleagues at the Department of Justice. Just remarkably amazing people. And I've had some opportunities to work with some great lawyers, but really the best lawyers I've ever worked with have been the people that I see in the department. And you get to do the right thing every day. And I'll tell you, sort of what my interpretation of that is. But it's a great feeling when you get up in the morning and you're able to say, what does my job ask me to do? It asks me to do the right thing. And that means everything. There are times our job is to make sure that we get convictions of people who committed a crime. But that makes sure the last part of that is going to be the key aspect. Make sure we find the people who committed the crime. And there are times when sometimes you get it wrong. And if you can intervene and stop something before the wrong person gets convicted, there's nothing more we can do than that. Now, make no mistake, it's immensely challenging. Public service career is very demanding. I worked harder in the Department of Justice than I ever worked in private practice. And believe me, I worked hard in private practice. But the hours that you log, and it's often at a pay scale that's reduced than what you can make in private practice, it's a lot of work. It's very demanding, but it's very, very rewarding. And you have some tough moments. Tom and I, before we came down, were talking about he asked me, like, what are some of your greatest screw-ups? Believe me, I've had some. You may have told some of you, getting ready for my very first trial, the judge asked me a very pointed question, and I didn't respond to it very well, and I promptly fainted. Yeah, I'm not kidding. It's quite a moment, though, when you're supervisors, and you're like this far away from your nose, and it's saying, "What? Are you all right? Are you all right?" My reaction is like, "What happened?" He said, "You're fainting." I'm like, "You're kidding me." There's an epilogue to this story, which is it was a status conference where I fainted, and the defendant, who was just a real hardcore guy, was represented by this great lawyer, just a classic criminal justice act lawyer, which means he's a guy appointed by the court. And the defendant's a real tough guy. And so after I fainted, I was kind of sort of get the status conference done, and I'm getting my stuff together because the trial's in like 3 or 4 days. The defense lawyer walks over, just a great guy with a great sense of humor, and he goes, then I didn't say this from my client. Do you know what my client was saying when you were lying on the floor? I'm like, I got no idea. He goes, he jumped up and he started screaming, "He's faking it! He's faking it!" And my reaction to that was, maybe I was. Well, maybe I wasn't. But that was sort of a tough moment, and that happened, basically within a couple of months of starting in the office. And I have to say, after that, I kind of took it in stride, and I was with a bunch of colleagues. Sort of in our office, when you start in a very high intensity unit where you deal with a lot of stuff. And so you go back and you tell people, like, this crazy thing happened to you before, and you've always got the answer. You think that's bad? What do you see what happened to me? And it was just a great collegial experience. But there have been plenty of times when there have been very difficult moments. I just described for you a couple about, that for me were emotionally very, and still are, very poignant. Another one took place about 8 months ago when I had to sit down in a room and tell family members of 3 men who had been shot by the New York City Police Department for just terrible confluence of circumstances, that we were not in a position to bring criminal charges against the police officers for discharging their weapons. And that was a very, very difficult thing to do because you can totally understand the dynamic that they were going through and the difficulties that they were facing. Some of whom had lost, and some of the victims had survived the shooting, one had not, and had killed the night before he was supposed to get married. And it was very difficult to tell his fiance, who was in the room, that we were not able to bring a criminal case against the officers. That was a very tough thing. And so public service is very demanding. It is not, it is not uncommon for, we have sort of a love-hate relationship sometimes with the agents that we work with. And there are times when the agents will make jokes about it being a federal Friday when they can't get you, like at 2:30 on a Friday afternoon. And I'm like, it's not a federal Friday, guys. I'm going to be here till midnight. What about you? Where are you going to be? But it is a lot of work. It's very demanding, but it is tremendously rewarding. And fundamentally, it's a great opportunity to really meet people from all different walks of life. When the time comes for me to hang up the spikes and look back on my legal career, it's my time as a public servant that I will remember most vividly, that I will derive the most pride from, and that I will feel the best about in terms of what I've done in life. Let me tell you a little bit about the U.S. Attorney's offices, to give you a little bit of a flavor of what they're like, because it will, and then tell you a little bit about some of the aspects of what it means to be an assistant U.S. Attorney. The U.S. Attorney's offices, there are either 93 or 94. I'm not entirely sure how many. In fact, mainjustice.com, which is sort of a gossip, sort of blog that follows developments in the department, doesn't know itself because you look on its homepage, it has 93 in one part and 94 on the other. So I'm a little confused. I do know there's one in Brooklyn. I know there's one here in Oregon. But they mirror all the district courts around the country. And there are probably about 7,000 to 8,000 assistant U.S. attorneys. And each one of those offices has one United States attorney. That U.S. attorney is variously at different times appointed by either the president or, as is the case for me, you're appointed by the court, which raises an interesting separation of powers question, which has never been litigated, but always struck me as somewhat curious. We handle, in Brooklyn, we have about 350 employees. We have about 175, 180 assistant U.S. attorneys. We handle thousands of cases, and they range from everything you can imagine to be a federal crime. Gun crimes, tax evasion, terrorism, racketeering, narcotics trafficking, immigration offenses, you name it, we do it in Brooklyn. The one exception to that is we don't do a lot of crimes that take place on Native American reservations, the federal government has jurisdictions over that. That is an issue here in Oregon and other states in the western part of the United States. As I mentioned, a big part of why I feel very strongly about a career in public service is my experience in book and the opportunity to do the right thing. I told you a little bit about it, I kind of alluded to that generally about what that really means. But for me, it means a couple of things in particular. And what really does it mean? I always look for guidance from the Supreme Court of all places. It's usually a good place to look for guidance. And they wrote an opinion back in 1935 in a case called Burford versus the United States, and they wrote the following. The United States Attorney is the representative not of an ordinary party to a controversy, but of a sovereignty whose obligation to govern impartial is as compelling as its obligation to govern all, and whose interest, therefore, in criminal prosecution is not that it shall win a case, but that justice shall be done. As such, he is in a peculiar and very definite sense the servant of the law, the twofold aim of which is that the guilt shall not escape and innocence suffer. He may prosecute with earnestness and vigor. Indeed, he should do so. But while he may strike hard blows, he is not at liberty to strike olives. It is as much his duty to refrain from improper methods calculated to produce a wrongful conviction as it is to use every legitimate means to bring a just one. And I think this is, as an AUSA, almost every AUSA knows this passage. It's where many of them have it taped to their wall or on their computer. I've got it up on my wall in my office. And I think this really summarizes what it means to be an assistant United States attorney. It's not just about being an advocate and arguing strenuously to convict somebody. When the time comes, it's definitely about that. Your job is when you step into court and you've brought a charge against somebody, your job is to seek conviction. But it's also to make sure that people who are innocent of crimes are not wrongfully prosecuted, and the right people are held accountable. I read a book a while back called Main Justice, and there was a quote in that from the former Assistant Attorney General of Criminal Division. Her name is Joanne Harris, and she said that the government wins even if the defendant is acquitted because justice has been done. That's not always a great salve after you've lost a case, but it does bear, I think, a reminder that being a prosecutor is a special process. It's a special trust. We often refer to it as a public trust. Being an AUSA really drives that home every day. We're entrusted as AUSAs with a great deal of discretionary authority, and that comes up in all kinds of different ways, whether making a decision about making an application for bail, or what evidence to turn over to the defendants, or what position to take at trial, or whatever it may be. And it really requires an exercise of judgment that is unique, I think, in the legal profession, and who's really, for me, has been a profound experience that shaped my view of my obligations as a prosecutor, and as a lawyer, and as a person. One of the things that Tom mentioned when we were on the phone talking about this, aside from reminiscing about PIPS was that to incorporate some aspects about the Constitution. And he asked, because that's a theme for the seminar or that you guys are putting on here. And I said, well, that's very easy because we think about the Constitution every day. First off, obviously, we think about very fundamental questions of criminal procedure, search and seizure. I'm second chairing a trial that's going to go at the end of this month, and I was just upstairs on my BlackBerry emailing back and forth about questions about whether or not we have a Fourth Amendment issue. We deal with questions of represented parties in the Fifth Amendment, Miranda warnings, and the right to counsel every day. It really is it's really striking to me how often those issues come up. But there are a number of other areas where that happens too. One of the ones that really surprised me the most is the 10th Amendment, which deals with federalism. Our jurisdiction, the federal government has limited jurisdiction. Every statute that we prosecute, we need to establish the jurisdictional hook for that, because the 10th Amendment reserves all other powers to the states. And unless we can demonstrate that there are a jurisdictional hook, we will lose a case. Great example of this, bank robbery. All right, the federal government has jurisdiction over bank robbery for banks that are insured by the FDIC. But it is not uncommon. In fact, it happens about once a year where the Second Circuit will reverse a conviction because somebody in the federal, one of the AUSAs, did not bother to put on any evidence that said, oh, by the way, this bank is insured by the FDIC. And that is a very striking thing. We have to think about that all the time. And the reason we think about that is because of the 10th Amendment and the way the Constitution is structured. Separation of powers. Remember I told you I was appointed by the court? That's a very interesting separation of powers question as to whether or not it's appropriate for the court to appoint the head of the office that represents the interests of the United States. never been litigated. And in fact, I think it works out very effectively, but it does raise an interesting separation of powers question. But perhaps most tellingly for me, and the thing that I think about, frankly, much more than I ever thought, is the fundamental basis of the Constitution, and that is the social contract. That's something that we think about almost every minute of every day. And what it means to work for a government that derives its authority from the consent of the government, where the social contract that John Locke wrote about almost 400 years ago is alive and well. This isn't just flowery rhetoric. It's a real-life embodiment of the principles enshrined in the Constitution. Government here derives from consent of the government, not from divine right, not from force of arms, not from fear or intimidation, but from the agreement of the people to submit to a government that serves them. That means that the authority of a federal prosecutor, somebody like myself, derives directly from the people from the citizens, and directly from that social contract, and that imposes special obligations. A friend of mine, who's an AUSA in the Eastern District of Philadelphia, who's tried a lot of gang cases, asked me to come down to the National Advocacy Center in Columbia, South Carolina. Why it's there, I'm not entirely sure, but I do like to go down there because one of the things that happens when you go down to Columbia, South Carolina is they have a very nice cafeteria, but it's not open for dinner. You have to go out of your own to eat dinner. Where am I going with this? Just in a second. And so my first time there, I go out with some friends who've been there already, and we go to a local restaurant, and I'm scanning the menu, and I find that I order something, and then there's an a la carte side that says you can order some vegetables, and one of the vegetables that's listed is macaroni and cheese. And so I love going down to South Carolina because I can tell my wife with a straight face that I ate my vegetables every day. So when I went down there he asked me to come down and talk about what it means to be an AUSA. So I had some time to think about this for some time. He actually wrote an outline, and one of the things he said was very poignant, and I literally quoted him back to the people I was talking to as I was sitting in the room because I couldn't say it any better myself. If you haven't figured out one thing from my talk so far, I am a plagiarist, as long as I give credit to people. But there are a lot of people who thought about this much more carefully than I have. His name is Rich Loret, and here's what he wrote. The United States is more than a piece of geography. It is, in a special sense, a way of doing things, a system of government. Lincoln said that this nation was conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. How we, as prosecutors, conduct ourselves as litigators is a part of that experiment that Lincoln identified in Gettysburg Address, testing whether that nation, or any nation, so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. Government attorneys are at the difficult fault line between the necessity of government and the conception of liberty and the dedication to equality that is the foundation of our nation. As such, we have a special obligation to respect and protect the litigant's liberty and equality before the law. It does not matter if the litigant is miserable, deceitful, or dedicated to nothing except his or her own self-interest. I thought that was a remarkable quote. And as I thought about that, I thought, yes, that's exactly right. It comes up in a number of ways that I never anticipated. I gave you some examples about the search and seizure questions or disclosure obligations. This came up for me very vividly in all places in Moscow when I was there for the deposition. And I'll give you a little war story. And then I'll wrap it up so I make sure I stay on time. I may talk fast, but I try and cram a lot. And this was, so I get to Moscow. And I have to tell you, I have to confess, I'd never been to Moscow before that. I've been back a few times, but this is in '96, and I was a little nervous. It's a little weird to stand in the Red Square the first time, particularly, like you guys come from a generation a little bit younger, substantially younger than me. My formative years were in the height of the Cold War, so it was really kind of a spooky experience to stand in the middle of Red Square. Fantastic. I never thought I would find myself there again. An indication that happened because of my career in public service. So I get there, and I'm at the U.S. Embassy, which in Moscow is a little bit like a fort. And we get a phone call from the MPD, which is the Ministry of the Interior. And in Moscow, in Russia, the MPD handles everything. It handles criminal prosecution. It's like taking the FBI, the state police, the local police, prosecutors, and rolling them all up into one. And it's very powerful. It has one key or kind of cool aspect to it, which kind of highlights one of the things that I always wanted to be able to do, but never really was able to pull it off, and that's to be able to wear a uniform while I represent the United States. And you can do that if you watch A Few Good Men. It's my fantasy to be the Tom Cruise character, or even the Kevin Bacon character. But you don't quite get to wear a uniform, although you do wear something, blue suits about as close as it gets. But in Moscow, everybody, they all have ranks. So, prosecutors are officers, colonels, and so it really reminds you, like, we do have a very special system. So we get this phone call from the folks at the MDB, and they say, we need to see the prosecutor right away. We pile in this car, and we drive across town in Moscow. And the police in Moscow are not particularly kind to the citizens, and so the way they get folks out of the way is they pull out their nightsticks, which are called pожалуйста sticks. Pожалуйста in Russian means please. They just whack the cars to get them out of the way, and people just move. Get over there, we sit down with these guys, and the first thing that the colonel of the MPD says is, oh, we're so glad you're here, and they just want to talk to me. So the defense lawyers out there, it's like, we've been thinking for weeks about how to stick it to the defendants, and so we want to talk to you about how to do that. And so, I'm thinking, okay, this is a decision point, all right? We can go one direction, which is we can stick it to the defendants, or we can go another direction. And I say, look, we don't need that, all right? Our system requires us and mandates, and it works, for the defendants and the government to get the same access to the witness. This is all I ask, is that you give us an opportunity to ask questions. And they're stunned. They're like, really? That's all you want? I'm like, yes, that's all we want. Just rest assured it'll take care of itself. Flash forward, we do the cross-examination of the guy who's the defense witness. He does what I expected, which is lie. I had a lot of fun in the cross-examination. And the MPD guys, it's like flicking a light switch afterwards. This is what led to being with them in a small room with a lot of alcohol and a fire. They were so fired up about this. They're like, wow, I can't believe it. They watched the cross-examination. They're like, you just eradicated that guy. And I'm like, that's how our system works. And it was an educational moment, but it was a tipping point. It was an opportunity where we could have gone one direction or another direction. And I felt privileged and honored that I had had been steeped enough in the way that the system works. My high school civics teacher would be so happy that we knew what direction to go. And that just reflects that this is an awesome and terrific responsibility. Now, make no mistake, I don't claim that prosecutors or federal prosecutors occupy this hallowed ground alone. All public servants, indeed all lawyers, play a role in that. And together, working together as public servants and people who are interested in public service, and I'm very happy that you're all here attending this, we can all play a role in charting the path of a road that started 400 years ago and still carries on every day today. Let me just give you a little anecdote. This is how I think about this all the time. I told you I like the movie Untouchables. I like a particularly corny part of Untouchables, so I confess I'm a little bit of a corny guy. You guys remember the movie? Remember when Kevin Costner, he's going in his first grade, he jumps into the big snow pile, and all the cops are kind of making fun of him because they're on the tape. And he turns to the cop right before they're about to bust down the door. This is how the movie begins. And he says, let's do some good. And everybody laughs about that. It's kind of a funny line. I actually took that to heart. I think about that all the time. And this is literally what I said to the folks in my office when I started. Let's do some good. And you all have that capacity. And if anything that you take from this, as corny as it may sound, I'd say, let's do some good. Thanks for your time.